Lupin the Third, The Mystery of Mamo, also known as The Secret of Mamo, and known in Japan as Lupin vs. the Clone, but originally released simply as Lupin the Third, is the first animated Lupin film released on December 16, 1978, right in the middle of Part 2's initial broadcast. Although technically not Lupin's first animated big screen foray, as Toho played an episode of Part 2 in theaters on March 1978 as part of the Toho Champion Festival, Mystery of Mamo is, for all intents and purposes, Lupin's anime film debut. Directed by Soji Yoshikawa and written by Yoshikawa alongside Part 2 writer Atsushi Yamatoya, the film deliberately harkened back to the tone and style of the original manga while also going in a more bizarre direction. This was a deliberate decision, as many Lupin fans were clamoring for something more akin to Part 1, which is why TMS brought a bunch of that show's staff back for this movie, including Yasuo Otsuka and Tsutomu Shibayama. TV standards and censorship also prohibited TMS from really capturing the spirit of the manga for Part 2, whereas a film would allow them to be much more adult, which also might be why Yoshikawa and Yamatoya were brought in to helm the project. Yoshikawa had worked on scripts and storyboards for Lupin Part 1 and had since gone on to work on various mecha anime, as well as series like Rasen no Hoshi, Future Boy Conan, and, though it hadn't aired yet, the 1979 Cyborg 009 series. He was also the chief director on Kirby Right Back At Ya, which isn't as relevant, but it's funny that this is the second video I've done in a row where I've mentioned it. I think that's a sign of something. Yamatoya was obviously familiar with Lupin by this point with his work on Part 2, and something I didn't mention in the last video is that he had previously directed a number of pink films. If you're unaware, pink films are a Japanese designation for films containing nudity and explicit content, including full-on erotica, with Yamatoya's most famous example being the 1967 cult film Inflatable Sex Dolls of the Wastelands. So if TMS wanted an edgier, grittier Lupin movie, these were the perfect director and writers to go with. Over 15 months of production, over 1,000 people worked on Mamo using a modified version of VistaVision dubbed Anime Vision that allowed for a better looking picture. Even though this was TMS's first full-length production, the company spared no expense with a budget of 500 million yen, an enormous sum of money at the time for an animated project that even rivaled contemporary live-action movies. Yet the effort paid off, as the film was a financial hit, becoming the 9th highest grossing film for the 1979 season in Japan. Today it remains one of the more famous Lupin projects, but within the fan community, it is also one of the most divisive thanks to its tone, science fiction elements, and for its philosophical overtones. We'll be talking about all of that in here, but to do that, we have to look at the plot, so let's put up a spoiler warning. The story begins with the execution of Lupin the Third, which, when Zenigata goes to investigate the corpse, is revealed to have been a hoax, as Lupin is still alive and is gathering supposed immortality-granting objects like the Philosopher's Stone. He's gathering these objects for Fujiko, who's working for a mysterious employer, but after taking the real Philosopher's Stone for himself, Lupin, Jigen, and Goemon are pursued by dangerous individuals sent by Fujiko's client. Fed up, Jigen and Goemon abandon Lupin and leave him with Fujiko, who hands Lupin over to her boss Mamo, a man who claims to have shaped the course of history for 10,000 years. Mamo says he has the gift of eternal life and is selecting a chosen few to receive it, with Lupin's skills in theft impressing Mamo enough to offer it to him. But Lupin, not believing in Mamo's promise, rejects him and plots to steal the Philosopher's Stone back. Mamo seeks to destroy Lupin because of his vulgarity and numerous betrayals, and as it turns out, he certainly has the power to do so. See, Mamo has actually cloned himself over generations, continually altering history as it unfolds to achieve godhood, and Lupin, as someone who represents chaos and free spirit, is a natural enemy for him. Already you can tell just how hard Yoshikawa and Yamatoya went with the story, creating a layered premise that unfolds into many different concepts and issues that the film takes time to explore. I mean, this begins with Lupin's death for God's sakes, and it only gets more complex from there. Whereas Part 1's mature stylings came from trying to make Lupin cool and brooding, Mamo's Lupin is much more of a psychopath, almost being more like a beast than man in some scenes. There's a lot more sexual imagery as well, with the most nudity in any Lupin project to date, especially regarding Lupin and Fujiko. We're back to the more rapey Lupin here, although this time it's put under a critical lens and not just played straight, something that makes these scenes at least have context even if they are graphic. That's the thing about Mamo, it isn't just throwing adult imagery at the screen to appease audiences who love filth, it's doing it to dissect and scrutinize what makes Lupin the person he is. Mamo's chief reason for hating Lupin isn't just because Lupin antagonized him, it's because he, as a self-proclaimed god, sees Lupin as unworthy to join him in his world because of his repressed, abhorrent nature. Sex and violence has always been an aspect of Lupin the Third, but with this film, you have an attempt to put Lupin under a microscope and put a theory as to why that's the case. And it's not solely putting the sexual and violent tones on display either. The movie is so dense with interwoven threads to tell its complicated plot. There's tons of political intrigue with Mamo's sphere of influence over events through time, and especially in the movie's depiction of the American government, which is shown as brutish and reckless. They're just as evil as Mamo, but a separate evil that's fighting against him, and the resulting conflict, without Lupin's intervention, might have spelled Armageddon for the world no matter the victor. No doubt this was all inspired by the Watergate scandal, especially with the characters of Stuckey and Gordon parodying American leaders, and, at least in the English dubs, Richard Nixon's cabinet specifically. Mystery of Mamo also provokes philosophical discussion of scientific ethics, especially regarding cloning. Cloning was rising in popularity around this movie's release as a serious scientific debate, especially with two major events: the 1978 book In His Image by David Rorvik, which claimed an American billionaire had successfully cloned himself, a claim now widely considered to be a hoax, and Louise Brown, the first human conceived via in vitro fertilization who was born during this movie's production. The movie discusses both ethical and practical problems surrounding cloning, in particular whether or not the cloned product is distinguishable from the original on a physical or metaphysical level. Mamo designed a Lupin clone, for example, and uses that fact to mess with Lupin's head as to whether he's the real Lupin the Third or just a cheap copy. It is revealed at the end that the Lupin we're following is the real one and the clone was executed at the beginning, and in all honesty, I wish this wasn't told to us. I think the movie earned enough goodwill with its storytelling to leave this open-ended. The last 40 minutes take a nosedive into heavy science fiction. I've already mentioned the cloning plot, but especially the ending when Mamo reveals just what exactly he is steps far into fantastical territory. The original Mamo is, in actuality, a giant brain that seeks to blast off into space and finally discover the secret of immortality out there. It's a weird plot point for sure, and I bet it also threw a lot of people off considering this comes as a complete surprise. Lupin has dabbled into science fiction before, but usually it was based in reality and or played in a comical manner. Mamo's ending is not only completely serious, but also challenges our perception of what the reality of the Lupin series is. Dabbling so far into sci-fi will not be everyone's cup of tea, but considering this was made as the genre was rising in popularity around the world, especially thanks to Star Wars, which is even directly mentioned in the original movie program, it makes sense that they'd go in this direction. Whether or not it works or is interesting is subjective, and it's one reason why this movie is polarizing, but I find it fascinating that Mamo doesn't let Lupin just be Lupin, it dares to find something deeper. At the very least, the characters are grounded enough in their familiar tropes to ensure it remains a Lupin story, even if it pushes the relationships between the gang to the breaking point. As I said, Lupin is much more of a scoundrel in this one, teetering back on the edge of insanity and sadism while still framing him as the quote-unquote hero of the story. Mamo may be one of the few instances where Lupin comes across as a straight-up bad guy, yet one we root for because the powers he goes up against are far worse in their actions. That's backed by Yasuo Yamada's performance, which is by far the most unrestrained he's been in the role so far, appropriate given the lack of restrictions on a movie compared to television. Everything about his personality is cranked up here, and while he doesn't reach the pure horridness of his manga incarnation, this is certainly one of the more sinister renditions of Lupin to date. But because this film is chiefly about breaking down Lupin's character, the others mostly take a backseat this time. Fujiko's the exception, as a sizable portion of the movie examines the Lupin-Fujiko relationship, why these two are attracted to each other, why they betray each other, and whether or not they really care about each other. It's one of the strongest examples that Fujiko genuinely loves Lupin and wants to be with him no matter what, and that he isn't just a tool for her to use and dispose of whenever she wants. This is one of my favorite versions of Fujiko to date, as while she does fall a bit too far into the damsel in distress role, it is nice to see her desires actually laid out and explored, something that a certain Fujiko-centered TV series would take to the extreme, but that's for another day. As for the others, they're mostly operating from the sidelines, acting as a support for Lupin's story. The crux of Jigen and Goemon's arc is them figuring out why they work with Lupin despite admitting they dislike his constant lust for women and his self-centered nature. Exploring that could have been really interesting, but this never really goes anywhere. The point is kinda hand-waved away halfway through, and Jigen and Goemon abandon the story for the climax, not coming back until the final minutes. Zenigata gets the worst of it, as he falls too far back into his typical role of Lupin's constant pursuer here. He's absent for the majority of the first hour, and while he has a great scene as the third act begins, his presence is more of a footnote. I do like his ending where he swears to chase after Lupin as long as he continues to exist, but it doesn't add any real shading onto his character. Oh, and apparently he has a daughter in this movie? Don't worry too hard about that, that's been retconned away. But the real character highlight here is the titular Mamo, who deserves his reputation as a memorable Lupin villain. Not just for his background, motivations, and sheer power, as I explained in the plot analysis, but also for how well he works as a natural opposition to Lupin. He is a man who desires to rule over a society of his own creation, and Lupin has the capability and desire to disrupt that system. In a way, Mamo admires that and wishes to preserve it, but when it becomes a weapon pointed in his direction, his attitude changes quickly. Not to mention, he's got a super cool design, based primarily on Swan from the 1974 Brian De Palma film Phantom of the Paradise. He looks both ancient and young at the same time, a perfect contrast given his backstory, and it's immediately a striking image. His voice, provided by Mito Komon actor Ko Nishimura, reflects this as well it is a clearly adult voice, the inflection can sometimes be very abrasive and childish. The design is classic Lupin to the core, rough and unattractive in many ways, while still leaving plenty of room for wild face contortions. Given the fact that this is a feature film, of course the animation budget and quality is bumped up tremendously when compared to parts 1 and 2. There's a lot of exaggerated body movements that hold up very well even over 40 years later, and I know that you can't see that in this collection of stills, but in motion you can really feel the weight of every movement here. I noticed a couple of poses that almost directly mimic the pilot film, again harkening back to the original manga both in tone and looks. And I love the character designs by Yuzo Aoki, as not only are they the closest to Monkey Punch's original art, they also create their own distinct feeling with sharper, more slender frames while maintaining the cartoonish edge. The backgrounds by Yukio Abe are also phenomenal, establishing not just location, but quality of life, how pleasant or harsh a room or region is to be in, and what we can expect from each new area. Something I haven't commented on yet in this retrospective series is the attention to detail in recreating real-world objects and places, especially the cars and guns. Yasuo Otsuka champions this level of care, and for Mystery of Mamo, the team pulled from 18,000 reference photos for background and mechanical items, with the end result looking fantastic. And that's important because despite Mamo's story going in absolutely crazy directions, there's never a point where it doesn't feel like it takes place in some fantasy world. It is our world, or perhaps a world we can conceive of given enough time. I will say though that Yuji Ono's soundtrack doesn't quite hit the levels it should thanks to a lot of songs from Part 2 being reused with only a few receiving new renditions. There's also a lot of repeated cues here, which can become very distracting, but when the music is completely original, it is very good. Those moments are just too fleeting for me. But despite its less well-defined aspects, Mystery of Mamo is a very captivating film, and often well regarded among the more hardcore Lupin fans, even if it does have its fair share of naysayers. I love it myself, but even I'll admit that if you appreciate Lupin more on its surface level qualities, this is not the film for you. It is missing a lot of the Lupin hijinks and adventure that many, including myself, adore, but if you're in the mood for something different, something closer to Lupin's origins, then this is right up your alley. But we're not done with Mystery of Mamo quite yet, as there's still the English dubs. And yes, I said dubs because to date, there are 4 English audio tracks for this movie. Yep, 4 independent adaptations with a new script and set of actors for each one, all differing in quality and care in recreating the source material. There are some reports that Mamo is actually the anime with the highest number of English dubs, but that distinction should belong to Dragon Ball, which has 6 known dubs, although many of those are missing. All 4 of Mamo's English dubs can be found on the Discotheque DVD release alongside the original Japanese audio, in addition to a number of awesome goodies for Lupin fans. For the dubs themselves, the first we'll look at is the Toho Frontier dub, created by Toho in 1979 for use on flights for Japan Airlines, and was also available to book at theaters courtesy of Toho's Los Angeles branch, and this marks the first English Lupin dub ever produced. Created by the now defunct Frontier Enterprises, the script is surprisingly accurate to the original, with some changes here and there, but overall sticking close to the Japanese dialogue. And that's the only compliment I've got, as the production values beyond the script adaptation are not good at all. In fairness, Discotheque had to assemble this dub from multiple sources and clean it up digitally for the DVD, so of course the fidelity isn't perfect, but even the execution of the dub is very off. The voice acting, frankly, just sucks, and we can't even completely verify these actors, though we can assume many are Frontier regulars, and some roles have been confirmed. Tom Clark and Cliff Harrington as Lupin and Jigen sound way too similar to each other, and both aren't very good at all. Patricia Kobayashi is too soft as Fujiko, Mike Warman's Mamo isn't nearly intimidating enough, and Goemon's portrayal by William Ross is awful, way too flat and lifeless. The sole exception is Greg Starr as Zenigata, who's actually not too bad. Unfortunately, while Lupin and Mamo's names are unchanged, every other main role gets the localization treatment, so I introduce to you Dan Dunn, Margot, Samurai, and Detective Ed Scott, my favorite Lupin characters. Next is the Streamlined dub, released for home media in 1995 as The Secret of Mamo, using the same cast and crew as the company's previous dubs for The Castle of Cagliostro and Tales of the Wolf. This script doesn't stick as close to the dialogue, but it's a decent adaptation most of the time. Even with everything it changes, and there are some things that don't carry over correctly, it all usually makes sense at least. It also includes an updated audio track with some nice, crisp sound effects compared to the original, though some of the added sounds are a bit much. Bob Bergen, the current voice of Porky Pig and Tweety, portrays Lupin very confidently and seriously, while knowing when to play out the wackiness when it's appropriate, and he makes for a fantastic Lupin. Jigen has a nice hard-boiled edge to him thanks to noteworthy Disney and Hanna-Barbera cartoon voice actor Steve Boulin, and while Goemon's performance is still a little so-so, Babylon 5 actor Ardwhite Chamberlain makes for a far better performance than the Toho dub. Both Edie Merman and David Pavel as Fujiko and Zenigata are a perfect fit for this adult storyline, and Robert Axelrod brings a much more sinister voice to Mamo that works very well. Despite its flaws, this is the best of the 4 Mamo dubs, with the greatest combination of writing and voice acting on offer. A year after Streamline's dub, Manga Entertainment UK released its own version on a limited release for European markets, with Lupin's name changed to Wolf the Third for, well, you know by now. The dialogue in this dub is the clumsiest in my opinion, playing a little too loose with the translation and not picking up the subtle details that make it work, and it's also got a bunch of added swears that oddly seem out of place despite this being a very adult work. The voice acting is solid for the most part though, while the late William Dufree, also the American dub actor for Bob the Builder, is a little too soft and shaky. He said that he had a ton of fun in the role, and that does come across. I also think Eric Myers and Tony Barry as Jigen and Fujiko do an okay job, and I especially enjoyed Goemon's performance by Garrick Hagan, aka Biggs from Star Wars. Unfortunately, Sean Barrett's Zenigata sounds way too pained, as if he's recording his lines while being squeezed in a vice, and while Alan Wanger isn't terrible as Mamo, he's just kinda bland compared to the Streamlined dub. The Manga UK dub is a decent but ultimately hollow attempt to do Mamo justice, and it's lacking in a lot of areas. Finally, we have the Pioneer Geneon dub produced by the same staff as their Part 2 dub and released to DVD in 2003. I already talked about this dubbing crew extensively in the Part 2 video, and while I think the voices are still perfect for the roles, their script for Mamo just isn't up to snuff. This dub has also received criticism for its dialogue changes and added jokes, and whereas they felt more naturally integrated with Part 2, for a script as precisely designed as Mamo's, the new stuff actively gets in the way in a lot of instances. The main cast is still a delight though, and Paul St. Peter's voice as Mamo is great, a dark, deep voice that's delectably evil. This is certainly not the worst way to watch Mamo, and as I said, the voice work is great stuff, but it often softens the impact the original version was going for. It's crazy how much these dubs vary in their strengths and weaknesses, and if you've seen this movie before but not these dubs, I highly recommend checking them out, either to see the movie from a different perspective, or to laugh at in the case of the Toho dub. I encourage you to watch this movie in the original Japanese if you haven't seen it before, but if you absolutely prefer dubs over subs, the streamlined dub is the way to go, then the Pioneer Geneon dub if you're a fan of their work. Discotek is releasing a Blu-ray of Mystery of Mamo for North America in March, and it will contain all 4 English dubs and the Japanese audio, with the Toho and Manga UK dubs featuring new restorations as well. I've already got my copy reserved, and honestly, you should too, because Mystery of Mamo is fantastic. It was shocking how much my opinion of this film improved after watching it again, and keep in mind, I already liked it when I first saw it. Many called this the ultimate film for Lupin fans, and even with its kooky, madcap storyline, I can definitely agree, as it's a great deconstruction of what makes the series work. But do not even think of making this your first Lupin adventure, not just because the tone is harsher and it's more sci-fi than Lupin typically gets, but also because its core revolves around dissecting and analyzing Lupin, and that requires knowledge of the series to fully understand. But it says a lot that even after seeing this movie 5 times for this video, I was never bored or sick of it, although believe me, I won't revisit this one for a while. As much as I adore this movie, I am just as excited to move on to Lupin's next adventures, especially the next one, Hayao Miyazaki's final entry in the series, The Castle of Cagliostro, a movie that is essentially Mystery of Mamo's polar opposite and another film that I love to death. For now, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a like, leave a comment, and make sure to subscribe and click that bell to see when new videos go live. Thanks also to my patrons for their support. If you want to support me directly and see new videos before they go public, you only need to pledge a single $1. Until next time, this is Cloud Connection, signing off.